The following is a presentation of Apologetics Press. Has the Bible been corrupted? In previous lessons, and specifically our last session together, we were answering the question, how do scholars distinguish between textual variants? What criteria do they use to sort out the differences between the manuscripts in order to arrive at the correct reading, the original reading of the New Testament? And I suggested to you that the ultimate, most effective way to reassure a person that the Bible has not been corrupted in transmission is to walk the individual through the resolution process for specific variants. In other words, to allow you, even though you don't know Greek, to see how scholars weigh the differences between the manuscripts for particular readings, and then come to the conclusion as to what the original reading was. Let's turn our attention now then to 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 24. This passage reads, "When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" This is Paul's reiterating of Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper back when he was on earth. Now, the New King James rendering says, "This is my body which is broken for you." The American Standard, the New American Standard, the ESV, and a number of other translations have, "This is my body which is for you." There is the textual variant. In other words, the question here is, should the word broken be in the text? Although the manuscript evidence, when you lay it all out, actually contains four different variants. One, which is for you. Two, which is broken for you. Three, which is broken in pieces for you. And four, which is given for you. Now, it really, I would suggest to you, is not earth-shaking in our efforts to figure out which of these four are correct. If we couldn't figure it out, it wouldn't alter Christian doctrine. But now look at the textual apparatus with me very carefully, and let's see if we can't sort this out. Notice in this particular Greek text, we have the letter B. And what they mean by that is that in weighing this textual evidence, they try to assign a value of certainty to the reading. And an A classification would be, we are virtually certain this is the original reading. A B classification is, well, we're pretty certain, but there is some doubt. And they give this particular reading a B. There's some doubt, but we feel like this is the reading. They're referring to reading number 1, which is for you. And notice the textual evidence that supports this view. Humon is the Greek word there, humon, which is for you. That is, the word broken is not preceding it or anything like that. Well, you have P46. This is a very old papyrus, going all the way back to 200. You have the 4th century unsealed Sinaiticus in its original hand. You know, some correctors came along later and made some corrections, and they're able to distinguish the original reading from the later correctors. Well, this is the original hand that dates back to the 4th century. You also have Alexandrinus, another one of the big three that dates from the 5th century, and you have Vaticanus, another of the big three that dates from the 4th century. And then you also have a Ephraemi Rescriptus, which is a 5th century uncial. That too is of ancient origin. And then you have another, this one is a minuscule from the 9th century. And then you also have manuscripts 1739, which is a 10th century minuscule. Then you have the Armenian translation, which dates back to the 4th and 5th century. And then you have a number of these so-called church fathers, these patristic writers. You have Origen, who lived about 254. You have Cyprian, who lived about 258. Notice that's way back, fairly close to the beginning. You have Athanasius, as he is quoted in Theodoret, and he dates back to 373. Theodoret lived in 466, but he tells us that that was Athanasius's quotation of 1 Corinthians 11:24. You have Pelagius, who lived 412. You have Cyril, who lived 444. You have Fulgentius, who lived in 533. Notice we then have parallel lines that are slightly askew that enable us to know that they are now moving to the next textual variant. Let's summarize reading number 1, which is for you. Unadorned with any other words like broken or given. Well, that evidence is varied, it is ancient, and it is diverse. Varied, ancient, and diverse. Now let's move to reading number 2, which is broken for you, humon klomenon. Here is the textual evidence. You have a later corrector of Sinaiticus who inserted the word broken. You have a 5th century uncial, and they put a little 3 by it, which means there were 3 correctors, and the 3rd corrector brought in the word broken. Then you have another uncial from the 6th century, and 2 of these successive correctors inserted the word broken, though it wasn't in the original. Then you have 3 9th century uncials that have inserted the word broken or have it in their original hand. You have an 8th, 9th century uncial Passy, and then you have a whole host of minuscule manuscripts that have the word broken. Notice all of those are later than the 9th century to the 16th century. Then you have what they call BYZ, which is an abbreviation for Byzantine manuscripts, which also are very late, and most of them, they say, have it. You have lect, meaning most lectionaries, which, by the way, date from the 9th century forward. And then you have a number of Old Latin translations. D, the IT stands for Italia. You have D, which is a 5th century. You have E, which is a 9th century. G, which is a 9th century. You also have some support in the Syriac version, both the Peshitta and the Heraclean. You have the Gothic translation or version, which dates back to the 4th century. And then moving to the so-called Church Fathers, you have Ambrosiaster as well as Basil, that date to the 4th century. You have Chrysostom or Chrysostom, who dates back to 407. You have Euthalius and Theodoret, which dates back to the 15th century. And you have John of Damascus that dates back to 749. Well, let's comment for just a moment upon this evidence. This evidence is certainly varied as well, and it too is diverse, but not quite as ancient as reading number 1, which is simply for you. All right, let's move to reading number 3, which is broken in pieces for you. We have D, which is a 6th century uncial, and they put GR and a little asterisk in order to indicate that the original Greek portion is the reading there. This is, in fact, a bilingual manuscript. All right, so you really only have one manuscript that supports that reading, broken in pieces. Then we have reading number 4, which is translated, which is given for you, humon didomenon. And notice that the textual critics that put together this textual apparatus, they put in parentheses, see Luke 22:19, and we will look at that in just a moment. And then they proceed to give you the textual evidence. Notice we have a number of Italia, that is Old Latin versions. Now they're all very late, 8th through the 13th century. You have 12th and 13th century in terms of this dem, and you have F, T, and X, 9th, 11th, 9th century. You have Z, C, which is an 8th century, but even that one, it's a corrector, a later corrector. Then you have VG. What he's telling you there is, this is the Latin Vulgate that goes back to the 4th century. But what the Latin Vulgate has here is not actually the word given, but the Latin word that means delivered, which is delivered for you, referring to Christ being offered for us. Then you have another Old Latin version that dates back to the 9th century, but it has quod tradidi pro vobis, Latin for which is delivered for you. So that's very similar to, in fact, it is a verb form of the same verb in the previous one, delivered. And then you have it z, which is a reference to the 8th century Old Latin version. And there the the Latin phrase translation is which for you is delivered. So it's very similar to the other Italian in using the delivered or the Old Latin, but it's worded a little bit differently. So notice there's strong evidence there in terms of strictly that one version. Now there are some Coptic versions, both the Sahidic and Bohairic dialects that date from the 3rd to the 6th century that also support the reading given. And then we have this ETH, which is a reference to the Ethiopic version that dates back to the 4th century. And then we have one church father indicated who dates back to the 5th century who supports the reading which is given for you. Let's summarize that evidence for that reading. That evidence is somewhat sparse. It's definitely very late as opposed to earlier and closer to the original writing. And notice that it's very narrow in geographic distribution and in linguistic distribution. A lot of Latin supporting it, but not much support of the other versions to the extent that you would expect if it were the correct reading. So sparse, late, and narrow in geographic distribution. Now, look carefully again at the passage. He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." This verse suggests that the scribe, by the way, what I'm doing here is going back to what the textual critics said there in the apparatus. They said, by the way, be sure to look at Luke 22:19. Now here is that passage. Notice that Jesus in Luke 22, that Luke tells us that he said, "This is my body which is given for you." That's not a textual variant. That is how that verse is to read. So what they are suggesting to you is that the copyist who inserted given in 1 Corinthians 11:24 was influenced by Luke 22:19. And then all of the copies that were made from that fellow came down through history and ultimately ended up having quite a few. And yet that's where he got that given, that the manuscript evidence doesn't support given in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 24. All right, so here are our 4 variants once again, which is for you, which is broken for you, which is broken in pieces for you, and which is given for you. How do we decide which of these is the correct reading? Well, notice reading number 3, which is broken in pieces for you, has only one support, one piece of evidence. And I would think on that basis alone we could dismiss it because it doesn't make sense that only one manuscript survived with the correct reading. Reading number 4, which is given for you, we are eliminating because it too, based on what we just said about Luke 22:19 and the other evidence, suggests that perhaps it too is not the original reading. So we're left with whether or not to insert the word broken or to leave it out. Here are your 2 major readings. Well, let's try to reason about these 2. First, admittedly, both have impressive external evidence. Number 2, reading number 1, which is for you, is in fact older. It has older external support than reading which is broken for you. But now let's turn to what the textual critics suggest we are to look at. In addition to external evidence, we must look at internal evidence as well, specifically transcriptional probabilities. Remember, the shorter reading is preferred because it's more likely that the shorter reading was the original, unadorned, untampered with. Notice that which is for you is definitely the shorter reading. Number 2, the more difficult reading is to be preferred. What do we mean by that? We mean the more difficult to the scribe. You see, if the scribe encountered, "This is my body which is for you," he would be tempted to elaborate and to explain. And the participles of number 2 through number 4 readings are really all attempts. You know, whether you say broken, or broken in pieces, or given. Notice that those participles are all attempts to make sense of, to explain the unadorned, simple, which is for you. Those 3 seem to be more likely to be elaborations on reading number 1. And then another thing to take into account on internal evidence. Remember we talked about dissidence, verbal dissidence. And notice that verse 24 uses the term broke. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the same night in which he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. Now that's not a textual variant. He broke it and said, take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. That's another form of the same word. So he broke the bread, and then the textual variant inserts the term broken. My body which is broken. So the verbal dissidence there suggests that the word broken should not have been there. And then you could also look at internal evidence in terms of Paul's style and Bible context. In fact, turn in your Bible to John chapter 19, verse 36. This is a very important passage because here you see we have a reference to Jesus hanging on the cross, and John alludes to certain things that happen, one of which is, you remember, the Roman soldiers came, broke the bones of the one of the thieves, then went over and broke the bones of the other thief, and then came to Jesus intending to do the same thing and found that Jesus was already deceased. So they didn't break his bones to hasten his death. And that's when John quotes from Psalm 34 and says that was a fulfillment of the Scriptures, which said not one of his bones shall be broken. Well, notice then that suggests that reading number 2 would be inaccurate. Because if Jesus said, take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you, and yet the Bible adamantly insists none of Jesus' bones were broken, then what would have been broken on Jesus' body? The skin? That really doesn't make sense. And therefore I suggest to you that the more likely reading based upon the evidence is that in 1 Corinthians 11:24, Paul originally wrote, this is my body which is for you. Let's turn our attention now to 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19. The New King James Bible reads, we love him because he first loved us. The textual variant in this passage is the word him. The American Standard, New American Standard, English Standard, and other versions omit the word him and simply read, we love because he first loved us. If you were to take a look at the manuscript evidence, examine all of the manuscripts that have 1 John chapter 4 in them, as it turns out, there are 5 variants. Some read simply, we love. Some read, we know. Some read, we love God. Some read, we love him. And finally, let us love one another. Well, that's quite a variety of possibilities for the reading of 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19. Let me walk you meticulously through the manuscript evidence. And again, I readily admit that this is tedious, might even be considered dry and boring to some, and yet this is the only way for us to get in there and understand what scholars mean when they say there are differences in the manuscripts. And it's the only way for us to get down to determining how serious these differences are and ultimately coming to the proper conclusion about whether or not we have the Word of God, whether or not the Bible has been corrupted. All right, look at this text with me, the Greek text itself, and the apparatus at the bottom. Look, for example, how the first indicator is the large B, which is their way of telling you, as we read the text, which they're telling us the original was simply we love, because he loved us. And so they say there is some doubt about that, but there is far more certainty than there is doubt. Notice then that they take us through the manuscript evidence for the reading agapomon, we love. There's Alexandrinus, which is a 5th century uncial. There's Vaticanus, which is a 4th century uncial. And then there are several other uncials that all date from roughly the 10th century to the 14th century. I said uncials, those are minuscules. Then we have the Old Latin version that dates back to the 7th century. Notice they have the letter Q, and that is the specific Old Latin version manuscript. And then they have VID. and that is their abbreviation, meaning complete verification is impossible due to a lack of preservation of the text itself. Then we have VGWW. VG, of course, is the Latin Vulgate dating to the 4th century, and WW is the Wordsworth White edition of that particular manuscript. Then we have ETH, that's their abbreviation for the Ethiopic version that dates back to the 6th century. The little elevated PP means that this is the Platt and Practorius edition of that particular one. Then of the church fathers or patristic writers, you have Pelagius, who dates back to the early 5th century, 412. Now notice you have Augustine, and they have a 3/4. That means that in Augustine's writings, he actually alludes to 1 John 4:19 4 times. And 3 of those times, he quotes the passage as simply, "We love," because he first loved us. And then the Church Father Bede, who dates back to 735. Now notice in our apparatus we have the parallel lines that are vertical, so now they're going to give us the evidence for the second reading, which is, "We know him because he first loved us." Well, the only evidence for that are some Coptic manuscripts, both Sahidic and Bohairic, 2 different dialects of the Egyptian version. These date to the 3rd to the 6th century. They then insert above that MSS, meaning manuscripts that are different from the edited text. Here is actually, you're looking at a picture of a Coptic version of the New Testament. And notice how in the Coptic, when translated, here is how that "know" reads in the verse. We know that he himself first loved us. So the Coptic version is actually the only translation that supports that reading in 1 John 4:19. We then come to the next reading, agapomon ton theon. We love God. Here we have the prestigious Sinaiticus 4th century uncial. We also have a 5th century uncial, 048. And again, however, the VID indicates that complete verification is not possible because of the preservation of the text. And then we have the words un agapomon, therefore we love. Now notice, even though the word therefore is inserted, this is still a manuscript that supports the reading, we love God. And then we have several other manuscripts. These are 9th to 5th century minuscules, a number of those that support that reading. Then we have an L with a 598 and 599. These are lectionaries. Remember, the books that were used in churches for scripture reading publicly. These are 11th century lectionaries. The little M indicates that the lectionary was the kind of lectionary that was used in the Eastern churches, which differs from the majority of lectionaries in general. Then we have support from the Old Latin versions, but these 2 are very late, 12th through the 13th century. We have the Latin Vulgate, Clementine edition supporting this reading. We have the Syriac, Peshitta, which is 4th, 5th century, and then the little H refers to the Heraclean Syriac. That dates to the 7th century. We do have 3rd through the 6th century Coptic version, specifically Bohairic dialect. We have the Armenian version that dates to the 4th and 5th century. They also indicate that the Ethiopic version from Rome, dating to the 6th century, the little parentheses there indicate there is similarity with this reading, but not exact identity. Then we have the Church Father Leo that dates back to 461 AD. That's reading number 3. Now the evidence for reading number 4, agapomon auton, we love him. Well, you have a 9th century uncial, K. You have an 8th or 9th century uncial, Pasi. And then you have 3 additional uncials that date from the 9th to the 10th century. And then you have quite a few 11th through 14th century minuscules. And then they allude to the Byzantine manuscripts. Most of those support this reading. Lectionaries in the Menologion tradition support it. They date to the 9th century and later. You have several 10th through 12th century lectionaries, although their use of the word we love, agapomon, has an omicron as opposed to an omega. And yet it still would be translated, we love him. Then you have the church father Augustine dating from the 430, another one dating from the 10th, Theophylact from the 11th century. That's the manuscript evidence for reading number 4. Now look at the reading for number 5, let us love one another. Well, that actually is found in only one manuscript. It is an old Latin version that dates to the 9th century. All right, now look at all of the possible readings based upon the manuscript evidence. How did 1 John chapter 4, verse 19 originally read? Here are those readings once again. We love him, or rather we love because he first loved us. We know, and we love God, we love him, and let us love one another. Interestingly enough, that final one, the Latin version, since it's only supported by one manuscript and only one location, Italian, one language, we can pretty quickly eliminate that as having been the original reading from the hand of John. May I suggest to you that reading number 2, we know that was found only in that Coptic manuscript, can also be eliminated, completely insufficient support, manuscript evidence to support that reading. Now notice readings 3 and 4, which are very similar. One says we love God, the other says we love him. Those are in essence the same, and somehow were connected in this manuscript tradition. But notice that this confusion suggests that copyists felt compelled to have an accusative object after the verb, especially if they took that verb in Greek to be a hortatory subjunctive, which you don't need to understand that. It's just that linguistically it makes sense that there would be confusion over the proper object of the verb, and hence some have God, some have him. That further suggests that these are suspect. Notice that reading number 3, we love God, has Sinaiticus, which is pretty strong support, and several versions, but the many minuscules that support it are very late. Notice further that reading number 4, we love him, has 9th century and later uncials, and most minuscules, granted, but they too are very late in supporting that reading. 2 of the patristic writers are late, and the other one, Augustine, uses the wording of reading number 1, simply we love, 3 of the 4 times that he alludes to this passage. Therefore, when we look back at reading number 1, just the unadorned we love because he loved us, that is adequately supported both by age and diversity of witnesses. This reading best explains, by the way, the rise of the others. You know, we love, and it would be easy for scribes to say, well, what do you mean? We love God, we love him. What else goes there? And remember one of the rules that textual critics have learned, they began to notice in the manuscript evidence, that the shorter reading is generally to be preferred as the original reading. And so may I suggest to you, based upon the evidence, the manuscript evidence, although there is some doubt still attached to this, it would seem that John originally wrote, we love, because he first loved us. Well, once again, we can't help but ask the question, now how critical is this? Does this alter Christianity, Christian doctrine? Does this mean that we don't know that we have the Bible? Absolutely not. It's simply a fine point, a minor point. Does the Bible teach that we're to love God because he loved us? Sure. Does the Bible teach that we're to love everybody because God loved us? Sure. There's no doctrinal matter here at stake. Let's turn now to yet another textual variant. I hope you're staying with me and concentrating and focusing and studying these matters. What about Matthew chapter 17 and verse 21, which reads, however, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. You remember early in our study I explained to you that a textual variant could involve as little as a single letter of a word, or it could involve a word or a couple of words or a phrase. It can sometimes actually involve an entire verse. and that is the case here. The New King James Version includes this verse, Matthew 17:21, but virtually all other versions since the American Standard of 1901 omit the verse completely. Well, why is that? Well, let's look at the manuscript evidence. Notice that there are really only two textual variants involved in this passage. It's either to include or to omit the verse. Now look at the apparatus at the bottom of the Greek text page on which Matthew 17:21 occurs, and we can sort this out in short order. Notice that they give this a B rating. That is, there is some doubt, but there's more certainty associated with it than there is with the doubt. Notice the first reading, to omit the verse, verse 21 completely. Here is the evidence that supports that. You have Sinaiticus in its original hand. This is a 4th century uncial. So you realize we're going back to 350 AD. That's very early. You have Vaticanus, also a 4th century uncial. You have the uncial manuscript designated by the Greek letter theta, and that is a 9th century uncial. That's a little bit later. And then you have two 9th century minuscules. The letters TXT attached to 892 means that the text of the manuscript is in contrast to the commentary that is found in that manuscript. Then we have some Old Latin versions. The little E above the IT is a 5th century Old Latin version. The FF1 is a 10th century Old Latin version. Then we have considerable support from the Syriac versions. You have the C and the S, which is Old Syriac, dating from the 2nd and 3rd century all the way up to the 7th. That C stands for Curetonian edition of that. The PAL stands for the Palestinian Peshitta, which is simply another Syriac version. Then we have some Egyptian support for this, both the Coptic Sahidic dialect as well as the Bohairic dialect. And these particular manuscripts date from the 3rd to the 6th century. So again, going back somewhat early. We have the Ethiopic versions, both the RO, which is the 6th century, and the MS, which is the 13th century, supporting that. And there's also a Georgian version, which dates back to the 5th century. And then finally, the church father or patristic writer Eusebius, who dates all the way back to the 4th century, specifically 339 AD. Now there's your support, manuscript support, for omitting the verse. Let's look at the support that adds the verse. They give that entire verse to you in Greek, and then notice they have in parentheses, see Mark 9 and verse 29. If you were to go to Mark chapter 9, verse 29, and look at it specifically in the King James or the New King James, believe it or not, there is a textual variant within that passage, where, by the way, that passage is authentic. And there we have the words "and fasting." This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. The textual evidence, according to these textual critics and those who put together this edition of the Greek text, say that it's virtually certain in Mark 9:29 that the passage should have ended with the word prayer. This kind can come out by nothing but prayer, and therefore, and fasting. Kai nesteia is an addition that really was not there when Mark originally wrote it. But notice then that they're telling you that the reason why this verse, Matthew 17:21, is there is because at some point a scribe familiar with Mark 9:29 brought the verse over into Matthew's account and therefore achieved assimilation to the parallel in Mark chapter 9 and verse 29. Then the apparatus goes ahead and explains to you the support for the reading "not thrown out except." This kind is not thrown out except by prayer. Uk ebaletai. And there are a number of manuscripts that have this. And by the way, the fact that that's in parentheses, supported by Sinaiticus, but notice the little b. That means it was a later hand that corrected Sinaiticus and therefore added "not thrown out except." And they're telling you by the parentheses that there are some other minor differences in punctuation. Then we have a number of uncials that support the reading of the words in prayer. These all date from the 5th to the 10th century, which that's some pretty weighty evidence. And then you have a number of 9th to 15th century minuscules. You have F1 and all the way down to Byzantine BYZ. And then you have the lectionary. They simply put LECT, meaning the majority of the lectionaries. You have a number of Old Latin manuscripts that support this reading, as well as Vulgate, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, and Georgian. This is broad support for that reading from the versions. And then you have a number of these so-called church fathers, patristic writers. They date from the 2nd to the 5th centuries, and they all seem to support inclusion of that verse. Now, let's kind of reason ourselves through this passage. If the verse came from Matthew, there's no convincing rationale for why scribes would have omitted it. Copyists frequently, however, sought to assimilate verses from the gospel accounts so that all of the passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke read the same when they're parallel. There was that temptation, or even if they did it unconsciously, simply because they were very familiar with the reading of one, and therefore they assimilated it to the other passage. Here is a case where a change was obviously made fairly early, getting back close to the 1st century. And therefore its manuscript descendants ended up influencing more of the surviving copies. But the evidence suggests, in spite of the fact there's a lot of evidence for the inclusion of this verse in Matthew 7:21, the evidence suggests that it was not there in Matthew's account, but it is in Mark's account, with the exclusion of the words "and fasting." Well, once again, when we look at this passage, we can't help but ask the question, is there any doctrine at stake in this variant? No. Do we know we have the content of the Word of God on this particular variant? Yes, we know that we have that. In our next session together, we'll turn to yet additional textual variants. So I look forward to studying with you at that time. This has been a presentation of Apologetics Press, an organization dedicated to the defense of New Testament Christianity. Visit us on the web at apologeticspress.org or call 800-234-8558.